Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome. I am Faisal Istarabadi, the director of the Center for the Study of the Middle East. And on behalf of myself and the center that I have the privilege of being director of, and the Center for American and Global Security, and Professor Shamit Ganguly and Bree Bailey, the associate director of that center, I am pleased to welcome you here again on behalf of myself and our colleagues at the Center for American and Global Security. This is the first of four presentations on the Iran nuclear agreement. This will be from the perspective of the dynamics in Iran. We move on October 5th, which is next Monday, I think, to the perspective from a regional perspective of the Arab states in the region, which will be a lecture by Professor Gregory Gauss of, I was about to say Vermont, that's not right, he is now at the University of Texas A&M.
Yes.
And then we move on November 5th, I believe it is, with Alan Cooperman from the University of Texas at Austin, who will tell us why the Obama administration's claims about the Iran nuclear agreement are, in his view, wrong. And then I believe on the 19th of November we will hear from Stephen Miller of Harvard, who I think tells us about the technical aspect.
And why the deal's a good one.
So the anti-Cooperman. All right, so we have the Cooperman and the anti-Cooperman. So I hope you will all be able to join us. They are all in this room on those dates at 5 p.m. And we thank the law school for, as always, being gracious hosts to us. This is a part of the 50th anniversary of Middle East Studies on campus. We have a number of activities planned throughout the year, including obviously this lecture series. For those who do not but would like to receive information from our center, me or one of us, to sign up, as I think we have an exciting set of activities planned as we celebrate 50 years of Middle East Studies, which also corresponds to the 50th anniversary of two of our constituent units, Central and Eurasian Studies and Near Eastern Languages and Cultures. I should also point out that the Center for American and Global Security will have a lecture on Friday, the 2nd of October at 4:30 p.m. in SPIA 169, the title of which is?
It's Dr. Lucy Chester, and she'll be presenting on the
The Eye of Islam.
The Eyes of Islam are
That's it.
watching. Transnational activism in India and Palestine, 1930 to...
1920 to 1948.
Okay.
It sounds like a really fascinating
Can
talk.
someone repeat that?
I beg your pardon?
Can someone
I can repeat
Yes,
that.
it's the, you want the
Eyes of
details?
Islam are watching.
Or-
No, just the title.
The Eyes of Islam are watching. Transcolonial activism in India and the Palestine Mandate, 1920 to 1948, October 2nd, in SPIA room 169.
And that is by Center for American and Global Security, which is, as it often is, our partner institution in this series of lectures, or co-sponsor in this series of lectures. With that, let me attend to one other, what I call housekeeping details, and that is please do turn your cell phones to vibrate or off entirely. I turned mine off. It's really disturbing to have the cell phone go off while a speaker speaks. One of the cliches of introducing someone to speak at a university is to say something along the lines of someone who needs no introduction. Or if I were to tell you what his credentials are, we would take up all the time available for us to hold this talk. Typically, that's a bit of professional courtesy, which is nonsense. In the case of Juan Cole, it has, as a friend of mine would say, the added benefit of being true. His credentials are incredible. But there are two things about Juan Cole, and I've had the privilege of knowing Juan for a number of years and of hosting him now at Indiana University, I believe, for the second time. His credentials aside, there are two things that have always stood out to me about him. The first is the breadth of his expertise and his ability to speak about so many different topics that cover much of the continent from India through the Middle East. To speak not in general terms, but in scholarly, with in-depth understanding of so many issues, the political issues, the geostrategic issues, the historical issues, the religious issues. He has simply an incredible breadth and depth of understanding of a vast swath of real estate. As I said, from the subcontinent west through into the Middle East. You will see, I suspect, some of that on display today. The second thing that has always struck me about Juan was on display for me again this afternoon when he met with some of our students for an informal talk. Not a talk, an informal gathering. We served cookies and coffee, and some students came, which he also did the last time he was here. And we always organize this at his request. And it is the genuine interest he shows in what the students are doing, genuinely trying to learn who they are and what they're doing, and to engage them in a conversation with them about what's important to them. So many scholars of the caliber of Juan Cole are so self-absorbed that they tell the students what they think is important. Juan Cole always listens to the students and engages them in a conversation on what they think is important. That is one of the things which has which has contributed to his earning a mountain of respect from me. I can think of no greater accolade to say of a senior and highly respected scholar than to say that. He reminds us all that the reason those of us who teach are here is for the privilege of interacting with students and not just to hear us running off at the mouth. Speaking of which, I've been doing a bit too much of that. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Juan Cole.
Well, thank you so much, Faisal, for that very warm introduction. And do I have a clicker? You have technical things. So, and thank you all for coming out. No doubt, you know, that being the first in the series is good and bad. It's good because I can set the terms of the debate. It's bad because they'll all come and refute me after I've left. So just try to remember what I said. Iran is a country of nearly 80 million people. What's the largest, demographically, what's the largest country in Europe? Germany. What's its population? So that's Iran. It's a very substantial country in the world. Its GDP has been very constrained by international sanctions orchestrated by the United States. At the moment, it's about $400 billion a year. It's on the level of Poland. But for a country that's under severe international sanctions, you know, that must make Poland feel bad. So it's on the verge, by the way, of becoming among the wealthier countries in the world. It'll be in the G20 before too long if the sanctions are released and if the oil and gas is exploited. There's this huge gas field that goes between southwestern Iran and Qatar. And Qatar has been able to exploit it and so has gotten fabulously wealthy. But Iran, under sanctions, hasn't been able to exploit its much bigger part of it. 4 trillion cubic feet, I think is the number. So, I would invest in gas stocks if I were you. I think prices are going to go way down. But B, those things that depend on natural gas, like, I don't know, electricity utilities, they might be pretty good bets. Anyway, Iran is on the verge of amounting to something. And my talk today is going to try to contextualize these nuclear negotiations in Iranian history, culture, religion, and politics, because that's usually not the way it's done. If you watch American television, there's no mention of Iranian culture. And it's odd, because Iran is a theocracy. It's like the Vatican. It's run by a cleric. You know, very odd things are said about Iran in the American press. We know what the Vatican's stance on abortion is. How many times have you heard it said in the American press that there's strong suspicions that Pope Francis is lying when he says he's against abortion? Or that there, you know, could be a secret condom factory in the Vatican. And since we haven't inspected, you know, we can't be sure it's not there. It wouldn't occur to anyone to say such a thing. But exactly that kind of contrarian logic is routinely applied to Iran, as if they don't really believe in the things they say they believe, and so forth. So let me back up and say that there are two great branches of Islam. The Sunni, not as some of our cable television networks have it, the Sunni Islam. It's the Sunni Islam, means traditional. And then the Shia. The Shia got their name because they're partisans. They take a strong side. After the Prophet Muhammad died, the question is who's going to succeed him, who will be his vicar? And just as you have this dispute in Christianity between the Catholics who say St. Peter and his successors are the vicars of Christ, and the Protestants who are often, you know, kind of like Paul better, and don't agree that the Bishop of Rome is necessarily the leader of everybody. So in Islam, you have this dispute over who should succeed the Prophet Muhammad. And the Shia believe that Ali, the son-in-law and first cousin of the Prophet Muhammad, you know, that's about as close as you're going to get to a son if the person doesn't have a son. And the Prophet Muhammad only had one son who died as a child. So Ali was seen by the people who thought that the Prophet should be succeeded by a close relative as kind of a son substitute. And so they were partisans of Ali, Shiite Ali, which made them the Shia or the Shiites. The Twelver Shiites, the ones who predominate in Iran, believe that after Ali, and Ali was married to the Prophet's daughter, Fatima, so their children after them are in the line of the Prophet, that there were, after Ali, 11 descendants of the Prophet who were spiritually the vicars of the Prophet, should have been the rulers of the Muslim empire, but weren't. They were marginalized. Shiism is a sad story. You know, you have comedies, you have tragedies. Shiism is as a story, you know, would be categorized by the Greeks as a tragedy. And the last of these, the 12th Imam, was thought to go into occultation. He disappeared from the eyes of human beings as a child, but one day will come back, just as Christians believe that Christ ascended into heaven and will one day return. The Shiites believe that the 12th leader or imam, the 12th imam, the 12th vicar of the Prophet, has gone into another dimension. We can't see him anymore, and he will someday return. He's immortal, you know, he's around. Actually, you should behave yourselves. You never know when the imam will notice what you're up to. But at one point, he'll reveal himself, come back. The disappearance of the 12th imam is a huge crisis for Twelver Shiism, you know, in the 9th century. Who's going to lead the community now? Who's going to be in charge? There's no imam. And the irony is that of all the Muslims, the Shiites made the biggest deal about it being absolutely necessary to have a vicar of the Prophet. And then they decided on a dynastic principle, and the poor things didn't realize, you know, dynasties end. So then what? So there's a division of opinion about what to do. Some Shiites thought, well, you know, we're on our own. We just have to, like, we've got the texts. We've got the Quran. We've got the sayings and doings of the Prophet. Others said, no, we need a knowledgeable successor to the 12th Imam. And so it had begun to be the case that you had seminary-trained clergymen in the Muslim world around this time. And a doctrine grew up among some of the Shiites that in the absence of the 12th Imam, if you want to know what God's will is, you have to go to the seminary-trained clergymen. There's no church hierarchy, but this is a little bit more like Roman Catholicism, right? You would go to the church hierarchy, to the priests and the bishops and so forth. So the Shiites developed a corps of clerics called mujtahids, or jurisprudents. And they were specialists in Shiite law and practice. And as a layperson, they developed the doctrine that lay people shouldn't, you know, just as you wouldn't like operate on yourself if you had a tumor, you wouldn't get like a butcher knife and start digging. You would go to a doctor. So what they said was, well, why would you operate on your soul? Your eternal soul is more important than your liver. So you would go to a specialist, just as you would go to a physician for a physical ailment. You would go to somebody who's been 8 years in a seminary and has studied all the texts and knows how to relate them and has the tools to interpret them. And you would ask that person, the expert, you know, how do I live my life as a religious person? How do I follow the laws and so forth? So this system is peculiar to Twelver Shi'ism and peculiar to a particular stream of Twelver Shi'ism. It doesn't exist among the Sunni clerics. So, but the idea is a layperson should implicitly obey the legal rulings of a trained clergyman. And if the layperson has a doubt, you know, can I do this, can I do that? Is it all right to wear cologne? Is it all right to drink wine? You're not supposed to try to answer these questions yourself. You go to the clergyman and you get a fatwa or a legal opinion about it, and then you're bound by that. And you should choose the most upright and the most knowledgeable to your understanding clergyman in your area to follow. And you would implicitly then follow his rulings on the law. Just on the law. Actually, not even doctrine. You're not allowed to ask him what to believe. You can only ask him what to do. So this is the system in Iran, and the jurist, the religious jurist, practices reasoning on the texts. You might have two texts that contradict each other. So there's a text in the Quran that says that the believers are not to come to prayers drunk. You know, sage advice. Then there's another text that says in gambling and in liquor, there's good and bad. But the bad outweighs the good. I think we've all had this experience. But one looks like it's all right to drink as long as you don't do it before you go to the mosque. The other one seems to be discouraging you from drinking. So how do you reconcile these two? Well, the one about not coming to the mosque drunk is earlier, and the other one is later, but you only know that from studying the text historically, and so it's thought the second one abrogates the first. Well, lay people are not supposed to engage in this kind of reasoning for themselves. You go to the trained clergyman. This is a picture of Qom, which is where a lot of clergy are trained. It's a clerical center, and that young man is hoping to have followers like you and me who will ask him questions, and he'll have a career. Now, there's a twist in the late 20th century, which is that although the clergy are supposed to be in charge of Islamic law for the believers, and the believers are supposed to obey them, that authority traditionally didn't extend to things like politics or doctrine or anything like that. But Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini developed a new theory, and I'm a historian, right? So I have to speak to you frankly. This is what we historians think. I don't know of any historians who disagree about this. There might be people in the audience who don't agree that Khomeini's ideas were new, but we think they were. We can't find anything like that in the old days. I think they were. And so what he said was, in the absence of the 12th Imam, you need not only to fix this problem of who you would ask about the law, you also need to fix the problem of who will rule. And that's not something that in medieval times the clerics had taken up for the most part. Because in the medieval times, the ruler was the guy with the sword and the horse. And if you theorized about who should rule, he would cut your head off because he knew who should rule. It was him. He was the king, and it was good to be the king. I think the scope for such theorizing was less in pre-modern times. But Khomeini, lived in modern times, and he theorized about this. Actually, he was in exile from Iran when he did it. Yeah. So even he was under danger. But what he said was, in the absence of the Imam, the believers are a little bit like orphans. We've been orphaned because the Imam disappeared. The Prophet died, the Imam disappeared. We don't have anybody to take care of us. We need a guardian, just like an orphan has a guardian. You know how those of you who ever read the Batman comics, they say that Robin is the ward of Bruce Gray, right? Ward, he was the guardian. Batman was the guardian of Robin. So Ayatollah Khomeini wanted the top cleric to be the guardian of us all, because we're all orphans in the absence of the Imam. And there's a direct line from his reasoning about how in Shiite law, orphans, widows, people who didn't have any position in patriarchal society, nobody to take care of them, nobody to guarantee them, nobody to support them, they became the charge of the clerics. So he's making an argument that since we're all orphans, you should all be the charge of the clerics. So this was called the guardianship of the jurisprudent, or the vilayat al-faqih. And Khomeini believed that, therefore, the ruler of a Shiite country should be a Shiite cleric, and he should stand for the Imam. He should be able to do all the kinds of things that the Imam would do. The Imam decided on peace and war, for instance. The Imam decided how the religious taxes were paid, to whom, and to whom they went. So clergy, the top clergyman would be in charge of all that kind of thing. And then, there's a kind of third worldism in his theories and anti-Americanism and so forth. But he came to power and implemented this theory. But because he came to power in a popular revolution, his original theories as they developed in Iraq in 1969, because he wrote a book called Islamic Government, had to be modified in the face of reality. So after the dictatorship of the Shah of Iran, who had been imposed on Iran by the 1952 CIA coup, the Iranians wanted a parliament. The Shah had a kind of phony parliament, and at one point he tried to make it a one-party parliament and so forth. The people, in the aftermath of the '79 revolution, they wanted a real parliament. And so Khomeini allowed that. And he allowed there to be an elected president. Originally there was a prime minister, but that having a president and prime minister and a supreme ruler was too much, so they got rid of the prime minister eventually. But there's an elective part of the government, and then there's a clerical part of the government. And the top cleric is appointed by something called the Guardian Council. About half of the members of the Guardian Council, who are all clerics, are appointed by the top cleric in turn, but the other half are appointed from Parliament. So there's a popular sovereignty aspect to even the clerical institution. But then there's what we know in Western democracies, there's a president, a cabinet, a parliament. All of those are elected institutions. However, the supreme leader would get to sign off on them. and could dismiss them at will. And then I would say as the Iranian system has developed, and partially again because it came out of a revolution, there's a third force, which are the technocrats. And these I would include the generals of the, say, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps. And some of them have higher degrees or engineers or whatever, or have been through some kind of military training. And then you have scientists, engineers, and they are a large group in Iran, and they're very good. I mean, you know, what does it mean that the whole world was so afraid of Iranian science that they put them under severe sanctions, right? And people keep talking about Iran because it has a religious government as being medieval. But then they keep saying that they're afraid they might develop an atomic bomb. So, which is it? Obviously, Iran has a very sophisticated scientific establishment. And they can be lobbyists for certain policies. The military, and they have two militaries, a regular military and a kind of National Guard, which is the Revolutionary Guards, or the scientists and engineers. So, being a historian, I'm going to tell you the story that around 2000, maybe a little bit before, the technocrats decided that they needed a nuclear enrichment program. It may have been that one of their impetuses to do this was that, you know, in the late 90s, the neoconservatives in the United States started alleging that Iraq had started back up its nuclear program. This was not true. Iraq never, in my view, had a really robust nuclear program, but it did have one in the 80s. They were using an unproven technology that never really produced much in the way of enriched uranium. And then after the Gulf War, the UN inspectors went in and found it and closed it down. UN inspectors are much better than people give them credit for. But then after the Gulf War in the 1990s, and especially 1998, President Clinton pulled out the inspectors in preparation for a set of bombing raids on Iraq, because Iraq had been violating the terms of the no-fly agreement. And the inspectors were never sent back in. You will see it routinely alleged in America, in politics and on the media, that Iraq kicked out the inspectors. This is not true. Americans withdrew the inspectors so that they could bomb Iraq without fear of killing the inspectors. So it wasn't an Iraqi decision at all. But once they were out, one of the problems was Iraq became opaque and anything could be alleged. And people on the right who wanted a war with Iraq and who were very determined and obviously very good at their jobs started alleging that Iraq had revived its nuclear program, and they got Iraqi expatriates to allege this, and it wasn't true. You know, back in the 50s, they used to give us, I think it was unwise, but they used to give us these Mickey Mouse watches that were painted with radium. They were neat because they were glowed green in the dark. It was, you know, we all wanted one. I'm sure I have a lot of struncheons in my wrist from that. But apparently by 1998, Iraq couldn't have made one of those. But it was being alleged that they could, and that they could make bombs. Cheney said they were, 2 years away from a bomb, and so forth. Well, I think the Iranians took this seriously. They thought, oh no, Saddam has started back up. The Americans are saying so. They started back up his nuclear program. So we better, have a nuclear program of our own. There's no evidence that they ever have wanted a nuclear weapons program. They wanted the expertise. So they started doing some experiments with nuclear enrichment. Pakistan had become how McDonald's is a franchise. So if you wanted to purvey hamburgers across the world, a franchise would be very useful. It's a brand, and you would know where to get the hamburger, and because of advertising and so forth. So AQ Khan and the generals in Pakistan had decided to become the McDonald's of nuclear proliferation. And they had gotten a hold of Dutch plans for how to use a centrifuge to make an atomic bomb, which they promptly did themselves. But then they were happy, you know, anybody who would come into the store and pay, they were happy to share the plans with them. So, you know, Libya bought some and Iran bought some. And so they went the Pakistani/Dutch route of centrifuges. Now, I'm not a nuclear scientist. And I'm not going to allege anything about the technical aspects of all this. I know, you know, what you know, so the very basics. Naturally, uranium is found in nature is 238. You know, and the problem with 238 is that well, that's not a problem. It's a good thing, but is that it can't explode very easily. So if you think about a billiard board, if you were playing billiards. Some people are really good. They can clean the table with the first ball, right? Just knock all the balls into the pockets. Well, you can do that because when one ball hits another, right? You can figure out where they're going to go, and they keep hitting each other until they're all gone. But what if you were to put spikes in the table, and the balls would hit the spikes? It would become impossible to run the table, right? Okay. Well, U-238 is like that. It has spikes. But if you could enrich it to 235, you get rid of the spikes. And then if you hit it, the little protons and neutrons, and they keep hitting each other. They hit each other more and more. They hit each other a trillion times. And it releases a lot of energy when they do that. It's like enormous piles, mountains of TNT going off. It would destroy everything in a 10-mile radius. So the U-238 that you find in nature is useless for this purpose. It has to be enriched. And there's a way of making it into a gas and enriching it, and then in centrifuges. So in very vague ways, this is what I know about it. And that's what the Iranians started doing. They started running centrifuges to enrich. Pakistan did this. You know, and if you enrich it to 3.5%, then you can use it for nuclear fuel. If you enrich it to 19.75%, you can use it to make medical isotopes to cure cancer. If you enrich it to 95%, you can make a bomb. Some people allege you can make a bomb at less, at 80 or 90. But yes, but it still has those spikes in it. And if you were making a bomb and you were going to blow it up for some military or diplomatic purpose, you wouldn't want it to be a dud. You know, you wouldn't want the whole world to be looking, hey, look, he tried to blow up an atomic bomb and it was a dud. You know, let's invade them now. So you would want to be sure that it went off. So then you would really want the 95% enrichment in order to make sure that it goes off. So as I said, the Iranians never have had a nuclear weapons program. They started running centrifuges, started doing experiments on civilian nuclear enrichment. Now, why would you enrich uranium for civilian purposes? Well, you could use it to run electricity reactors. We have 100 in the United States. South Korea has them, France has them. Most electricity in France comes from them. Why is that bad? Well, it's not bad. In fact, it has virtues. It's low carbon, for one thing. If we could build lots of them really quickly, we might avoid, you know, swimming with the fishes. But the problem is that this particular technology of centrifuges is dual use. So if you know how to enrich to 3.5% for fuel, and you know some other things, which are very technical, and maybe the Iranians still don't know them, you could theoretically keep feeding this spec through the centrifuges, and then you get 19% and 50% and 95%, and boom, you've got a bomb. So it's nervous-making to have somebody running centrifuges. If they seem hostile to you. People are running centrifuges and enriching uranium all around the world all the time, a small number of countries. Some countries have given it up, by the way. Argentina stopped doing it. And Brazil was going in that direction. They stopped. South Africa stopped, we hope. And but, you know, the French do it all the time. And the Japanese import their fuel, but we know they wanted to make a bomb, the Japanese. They seem to be good at gadgets, and they have a lot of fissile material on hand. They have a lot of plutonium, which, you know, isn't used for anything else. Why do they have all that plutonium? So with some countries, we don't mind if they're doing it. We don't. It doesn't come in our news. It doesn't make us nervous. But Iran, you know, somebody whose crowds chant death to America, and then they're also spinning centrifuges, that makes a person nervous. Now the Iranians began doing this secretly. Now they had signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which requires you to report this kind of, if you start doing these experiments, you have to report them to the UN. They didn't report them. That seems suspicious. If their intentions are good, why wouldn't they just report it? But there is a possible explanation for them not reporting it, which isn't sinister, which is that the French in the 1970s built a nuclear reactor, civilian power plant for Iraq. And it's a light water reactor, and the French were very careful to design it in such a way that it could not be used to make a nuclear weapon. And light water reactors, theoretically, Alan Cooperman will tell you a light water reactor could be used to make a bomb. But in the real world, this has almost never been done, and when it was done, it was one of those dud bombs. So Alan Cooperman and I are friends. This is not a slam at him. But he thinks it's easier to do things than it actually is. So in any case, they made it so that light water reactor never in a million years could have actually been used to make a bomb. But the Israelis, who have a nuclear arsenal, wanted to remain the only nuclear state in the Middle East, and they were alarmed by even a civilian light water reactor, and so they bombed it. So if you were Iran and you were thinking of maybe making some nuclear reactors and nuclear material to fuel them, would you really like call up Tel Aviv and say, Bibi, guess what? So they did it secretly. And they did it in a facility near the city, the beautiful, wonderful city of Isfahan, which now that it's becoming possible, I urge you all to visit. It was in the 1600s, the greatest city in the world possibly, a very large population by world terms at that time, wonderful architecture, and it produced a saying in Persian, Esfahan Nesfe Jahan. Isfahan is half the world. It was such a large metropolis. Near to Isfahan, there's now this Natanz. The Natanz was where they did these experiments. Now there's a dissident group, they are called Islamic Marxists, the Mujahideen Khalq, who committed a lot of terrorism in Iran and allied with Saddam Hussein against Iran and got a camp in the Iraqi side. And their initials in English is MEK. They're the People's Jihadis. They don't like the Iranian regime at all, would like to see it overthrown. And they seem to have a tacit alliance with the Israelis. So they do spying inside Iran. And they found out about this and blew the whistle on it. And in fall of 2002. So by early 2003, the Iranian government came clean with the international community, and they reported to the International Atomic Energy Agency that, yes, we're doing this. And the first thing the Europeans did was to go to Iran and say, what? You know, we don't want you doing this kind of thing. And at that time, there was a relatively liberal president, Mohammad Khatami, who wanted good relations with the West. And he sent this nice man, Hassan Rouhani, to be his negotiator in Europe. And Khatami said, okay, we won't enrich, we'll have a pause. That pause lasted for 2 years, till the end of the Khatami presidency. But then Khatami was succeeded by a much more obstreperous president, Ahmadinejad, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who insisted on, for Iranian national glory, not buckling to the Europeans and the Americans, and insisted on starting back up the original. As far as we can know, the International Atomic Energy Commission inspectors who have been all over this place have never found any diversion of uranium to military purposes. This was a civilian program. And they have built, the Russians built for them, I think originally it was the Germans were going to build it, but then it got taken over by the Russians. The Russians built for them 3 reactors down at Bushehr on the Persian Gulf, which are now live. I mean, they're producing electricity. And the purpose of the nuclear enrichment was to produce fuel for those reactors, and for more, which are planned. In other words, Iran is going to go the French path, and the South Korean path, to some extent the Japanese path of having, Japanese had to have a pause after their tsunami, but they're starting them back up now. They have most of their electricity generated by nuclear. Now, critics of Iran would say, well, why are you doing that? You're floating in fossil fuels. Just use them to generate your electricity. But the problem is that Iran, and actually in Saudi Arabia, Hawaii, some places, you know, petroleum is used to generate electricity. It's not so much in mainland United States. It is in Iran. But the problem with that is petroleum is a relatively valuable export commodity. If you use it all domestically by driving and making electricity, then you don't have any income coming in. So if you get your electricity instead from the reactors, then that means you can export the petroleum instead, and you get much richer. So lots of countries do this. I mean, even Saudi Arabia is now going to make a lot of reactors for exactly the same reason. They're starting to use a lot of their own petroleum for electricity production. And it's objectionable that Iran does it, but it's not objectionable that Saudi Arabia does it. Why? The other thing is, Iran is very keen to remain energy independent, in which case I would advise them to go wind and solar. But in any case, they think that one of the reasons the United States doesn't want countries to have civilian nuclear enrichment is that the United States wants to control the world's energy distribution and use it as a way of subjecting people. So they think that, that having your own nuclear reactors makes you independent of the American world system. And of course, a lot of petroleum distribution is in the hands of the United States, and we just proved from 2012 till now that if we wanted to go around stopping Iran from exporting its petroleum, we could. Which means we could also stop them from getting fuel for electricity. So one of the reasons they say they want to do this is for their independence, which is, by the way, the same discourse that exists in France. And I have a colleague who wrote a book, Gabriel Hecht, called The Glory of France, which is about the nationalist rhetoric around the French nuclear program. But part of it is about national glory, national independence. And the same thing is true of Iran. Now, the stance of the Shiite, top Shiite clergy, Ayatollah Khomeini, and now his successor, Khamenei, I'm sorry, they sound similar, but they're not in Persian. Khomeini in Persian doesn't sound at all like Khamenei. They're different altogether. But in English, we don't have so many khas, so they sound similar. But Khamenei is the successor of Khomeini. Both of them said that the nuclear weapons are the tool of the devil and are absolutely forbidden. And Khamenei has said this till he's blue in the face. He has given many public speeches in which he's denounced nuclear weapons. He says, we do not need a nuclear bomb. We do not have any objectives or aspirations for which we will need to use a nuclear bomb. We consider using nuclear weapons against Islamic rules. And he has said it even more explicitly. He said making, stockpiling, and using nuclear weapons is evil and against Islamic law. He is the supreme theocrat. And we're always condemning Iran that it's a theocracy. But we don't seem to take seriously that Khamenei says this. This is the policy of his government according to the person who's in charge. Now people say, well, he's lying. That's the same argument that the people, it's like saying that the Pope has a condom factory. Why would he lie? What does he get by lying? And if he were found to lie, wouldn't it kind of undermine his religious authority with people? If you're a clergyman, you say it's bad to kill people, then in your spare time you're a serial killer. I don't think a lot of people are going to come to your church. So this is dangerous for him to lie. And there is nothing to suggest that he's lying. The national intelligence estimates of 2007, 2010, the International Atomic Energy, those are the CIA estimates, the International Atomic Energy Agency inspections, everything that we know about Iran is that it doesn't have a weapons program. And so we are misled by a lot of rhetoric in the United States by coming out of our media and our politicians. They actually will say on CNN or these other channels, Iran's nuclear weapons program, when there's none in evidence. The United States has made a deal to close down the program. It doesn't exist. You can't close it down. And the United States has made a deal to forestall any weaponization, but it hasn't made a deal to close down a program that doesn't exist. And then I saw on the web this person gave a speech at some university in the Midwest was saying that we have a right to be concerned that Iran might develop a nuclear weapon because they've said they want one and they want to use it against Israel. No. They haven't said they want one. They haven't said they would use it against anybody. Actually, they said we don't have any aspirations for which we would need to use a nuclear weapon. We don't want to bomb anybody. You can be suspicious that that's what they want to do, but you can't say that they have said that that's what they want to do. But this is the discourse in the United States. It's just wild things are attributed to them which are not in evidence. Actually, Khamenei has repeatedly said that Iran has a no first strike policy. So you strike them, they might come back at you, but they won't initiate the striking. And there's not good evidence to the contrary. This seems to actually be their policy. Then again, he says in 2012, the Iranian nation has never pursued and will never pursue nuclear weapons. There is no doubt that the decision makers in the countries opposing us know well that Iran is not after nuclear weapons because the Islamic Republic logically, religiously, and theoretically considers the possession of nuclear weapons a grave sin and believes the proliferation of such weapons is senseless, destructive, and dangerous. Okay, maybe he's lying, but you have to at least know what he said. You can't impute to him statements that he did not make. So, how to explain what they're up to? Well, my theory of it, which I started proposing in 2007, because I'm interested in this whole thing as a puzzle, is that what they're really after is what's called, or what they were originally really after, was what's called nuclear latency. Or sometimes it's called a breakout option or a Japan option. I think nuclear weapons are mainly defensive weapons. They can't be used very easily, especially in a world where more than one power has them. But having them kind of protects you from being invaded. as the Soviets found out, it doesn't protect you from your government collapsing. But other countries probably aren't going to invade you if you have a nuclear weapon. There's this story that in 2002, it appeared in the Indian press, that the then right-wing BJP government, was near to going to war with Pakistan. And the story is that Advani went to the RAW, the Research and Analysis Wing, and said, could we, Pakistan has 14 bombs, could we sequester them somehow so that then we could take action against Pakistan? And the story in the press, at least, was that the RAW came back to Advani and said, well, sir, we're confident we know where 13 of them are. So then no war. But if you knew that a country could make a bomb really quickly, because remember, from the time that Bush announced that he was going to invade Iraq, more or less, in September of 2002, until the US actually invaded Iraq in late March, it's a long time.
Right.
If you had thought that Iraq could put together a bomb in 4 months, then you wouldn't do that, right? So, and likewise with Japan. I don't know what their breakout framework is, but I suspect it's short. So if North Korea decided to gun for Tokyo, I think we would see some mushroom clouds. I think having a known latency potential is a pretty good deterrent to being invaded. And after 2003, Iran had good reason to want to avoid being invaded because its neighbor had been. The Americans in Baghdad kept coming out in public and giving press conferences, and they would say there should be no foreign interference in Iraq. And the Iranians would fall down laughing, that Americans were saying this in a country that they had occupied. But the Iranians were, on the list. If things had gone well in Iraq, the Cheney people wanted to go on to Iran. In fact, the neoconservatives had a saying in 2003. They said, everybody wants to go to Iraq. Real men want to go to Tehran. And these guys, they're not like, they don't work out, they have pencil-thin arms, they don't, don't look macho, but they talk like real men, So anyway, I think that probably some of the Revolutionary Guards commanders wanted a bomb, and I think some of the scientists and engineers wanted a bomb for defensive purposes. And then, as we have seen, the top leader said, no bombs. So I think they went to him and said, look, we want to do some experiments. He said, no bombs. They said, no bombs, experiments. In fact, if people know we are doing these experiments, it will make us less likely to be attacked. All right, but no bombs. And I think that's how we got where we are. I think a lot of the fear of an Iranian weapon program was not anyway, because Pakistan has a bomb, India has a bomb, Russia has a bomb, China has a bomb, and yet we all ate breakfast this morning. So if Iran had a bomb too, how would the world really change? It's not very likely they would use it, certainly not on countries that have them, like Israel and the United States, because then that nice Isfahan won't be there anymore. Why is all this hysteria anyway? Well, I think partly it's that Iran is now weak geopolitically, and the hegemonic powers, the United States, Israel, Saudi Arabia, don't want Iran to be strong, and even having a latency or a breakout option would make it stronger. So you don't want that. You want to close it down. And I think also it didn't help that Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was president for all those years, and he also said the same things as Khamenei, that we don't want a bomb, we would never use a bomb, and so forth. But he he really shouldn't have been speaking in public. And so he made a lot of enemies for Iran, and you know, at one point he quoted Khomeini that the occupation regime over Jerusalem should vanish from the page of time. And our press mistranslated this as Israel should be wiped off the face of the earth, or off the face of the map. And there is no such idiom in Persian, and it's not what he said. He was hoping that Israel would go the way of the Soviet Union, is what he was saying. But then this became a tagline. And to this day, when I deny that he said this, I'm attacked, I'm ridiculed, as if, you know, it's taken on a life of its own. It's irrefutable. It doesn't matter whether you really said it or not. Everybody's going to say that he said it. And that's another thing. They said we don't want Iran to have a nuclear weapons program because it says it wants to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. Well, they never said that. They don't like Israel. They wish that, you know, the state of Israel would collapse. That would make them happy. You know, they say that Palestinians should have the same voting rights as everybody else, but they don't say they're going to roll tanks against Israel, which is anyway silly. The Israeli army would beat the pants off of them, and Israel has 400 nuclear weapons. And Iran, although you would not know this from our press, doesn't have any nuclear weapons. So you can't attack Israel. Go through this. So anyway, Iran was weakened by the 2009 demonstrations against Khamenei's putting of Ahmadinejad in for a second term. There were massive demonstrations. I think the regime was shaken by that. And then the Obama administration started negotiating with the regime. The first negotiations didn't go well. And after that, Obama decided to put in really severe sanctions. They got Iran kicked off the currency exchanges of the world, including the South Asian one. So there was no way that Iran could be paid for its oil. It couldn't go through banks. It started accepting barter, you know, I don't know, toys, anything. You had to send them there and they would send you back oil. So it was very bad, and of course the Iranian currency collapsed and a lot of people were economically hurt. And I think, you know, the Iranian middle classes are a bulwark of the regime, and they were complaining very bitterly about this situation. And then you'd had the Green Movement and the protests. And I think even Khamenei, although he's the supreme leader, you know, he became afraid that Iran could become unstable. And he saw what happened to Mubarak and all those other Arab leaders in the 2011 and 2012 youth revolutions. So when Kerry becomes Secretary of State and wants to push this policy again, he finds some willingness. And then the big thing was Ahmadinejad went out and Hassan Rouhani became president. And Rouhani, remember, was the one who negotiated the freeze back in 2003, 2005. So I think he goes to the leader, to Khamenei, and says, leader, you know, Iran is in a very difficult economic position because of the severe sanctions. I want to get Iran out of this position. I think people are very dissatisfied. The revolution is in danger. Your rule is in danger. And Khamenei says, well, you know, the outsiders are evil and they're punishing Iran for no reason. We don't want a nuclear weapon. And Hassan Rouhani says, well, leader, you know, I don't think they have that impression of us. I don't think they believe you when you say that. So let's let the inspectors in and see we're not doing anything wrong, since we're not. And then the sanctions will go away and Iran can become prosperous. So Khomeini says, well, you know, they're evil and they're trying to overthrow us and I don't trust them. But yes, go and talk to them. If you can get a deal, fine. But you won't. So I think also the Revolutionary Guards were very divided over these negotiations because some of them were making money off the sanctions. Like if you can't send some goods to Iran, then they can bring in the goods and gouge people with them. And but then there were other corporations. The Revolutionary Guards, by the way, is like a multinational corporation. It has a lot of companies, holding companies and things. But there were other parts of their empire, economic empire, that would benefit from the loosening of sanctions. And I think those weighed in with Rouhani, with the supreme leader. And so that's one of the ways that this happened, is that some of the hardliners peeled off and supported it. And I'm coming to an end now. But basically, there were 4 possible pathways to a nuclear bomb in Iran. You had the Natanz enrichment facilities with the centrifuges running there. Then they made another centrifuge facility in a mountain near Qom called Fordow. And then they were building a heavy water reactor, which heavy water reactors, the nuclear material builds up on the rods and plutonium. So you could, that's how the North Koreans got a bomb, was with the heavy water reactor. So we really don't want the Iranians having heavy water reactors. And then they could potentially make one covertly. Although making an atomic bomb needs enormous amounts of water and electricity, and you would have trucks coming, and we have the whole country under satellite surveillance. So I don't think it would be very easy for them to do it covertly. But if you have inspectors crawling around every place with these, they have machines that can detect plutonium signatures. You can't get rid of this. People are complaining in Congress that if they get a tip that off-site there's some activity going on, say in some army base or something that's not covered by this, the Iranians have to let the inspectors in within 24 days. They said, well, they could clean up the evidence. They don't seem to understand that nuclear radiation is not, it's not like in the TV shows, the detective shows, they show you scrubbing off the blood, after you've killed somebody. This is not how it works with nuclear. They have tried this, some countries have tried, the Iranians even have tried it in the past, of cleaning up signatures. And they last at least 6 months. There's no way to hide them. So the Obama administration maintains that it closed off all of these avenues. They redesigned the Iraq reactor to be a light water reactor, and they actually concreted in part of it. And they're reducing their centrifuges from 20,000 to 6,000, and they're enriching no higher than 3.6%. Alan Cooperman will come and tell you that it doesn't matter, they're still making a bomb. But I'm taking Shiism seriously. I'm saying that if we look at Iran's modern history, we look at its culture, we look at how it's run, the doctrines under which it's run, and so forth, that we can make sense of this attempt to have a nuclear breakout option, which is, I think, what was really going on. And now they've even given up that. They've given up enriching uranium to sell it, because the Argentinians were doing that, and they stopped doing it. But the Iranians were hoping to do that as well. They've given up almost everything. I mean, if you look at this from the Iranian point of view, they really, put their heads down and accepted a very harsh regime of the international community. But in return for which, they could get rich. So that's what I have to tell you, and I'll stop there. Shall I take questions?
Please, go ahead.
Yes.
In order to take Shiism seriously, I think that one of the common criticisms of Khomeinism's fatwa is that this may be a mechanism by which taqiyya is operational. And so I'd be interested in hearing your commentary on why that's not the case, and perhaps even more, whether there have been examples of fatwas in Shiism being used as mechanisms of taqiyya, or if that's just
As mechanisms of
taqiyya.
Oh, no. So taqiyya, what's being brought up is that the Shiites in early Islamic cultures were a minority. And Sunnis are generally good, nice people, but there were occasionally hardliners amongst them that did think it was necessary to kill the Shiites. And if an angry crowd came to your door and said, you're a Shiite and we're going to therefore kill you, a doctrine arose which seems to be quite sensible among the Shia, that under such a circumstance, you could lie and say, oh no, I'm a Sunni. I really love Abu Bakr, this caliph. And I couldn't tell you how much I like Omar. The conditions under which Shiite doctrine allows you to behave this way are that your life or that of your loved ones should be in danger. And your property should be in danger. Immediate danger, not general danger. And this doctrine is operating where there's not a Shiite government. So no, you have a Shiite Islamic Republic, you can't practice taqiyya, you can't lie, and you know, you can't go into a liquor store and the guy says, you're a Muslim, I'm not allowed to sell you liquor, and the other guy says, oh no, I'm a Christian. You can't do that if your life isn't in danger, and if you're living in a Shiite state especially. And the Shiite officers of the Shiite state are not allowed to practice it because their lives cannot be in danger. I mean, this was a doctrine to protect people living under Sunni rule who were in danger as individuals. The idea of a state taqiyya is, I mean, why not just say they're lying? You know, why go to all this here and there? And this was, I think, you know, this issue only comes up because there were people in the American security and intelligence establishment who wanted to convince the others that you can't trust Iran, that they're lying, and we have to go to war against them. So thank you for bringing that up because it is one of the controversies been in the New York Times and so forth. But no, at least from the point of view of an intellectual tradition like that of Khamenei, the idea of a fatwa being taqiyya in a Shiite state is just a non-starter.
Well, and just to remind you, you do have a bottle of water over there if you'd like it.
Oh, I didn't see that.
I think that's for you, isn't that right?
Correct.
Thank you. Yes, in the purpose.
Thank you. Yes, thanks for your talk. I had a question about sanctions and the relationship to the Revolutionary Guard. You mentioned how some of them have been benefiting financially from sanctions. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that. And also, has there been discussion as to how, if they could benefit financially if they are actually listed too? Because of course there's so many corporations very interested in investing in banks in Iran if sanctions are and have apparatus ready to go. So the people who have access to these large funds, they may also benefit financially
Sure.
if the sanctions are listed. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit more.
Yeah, well, I think the Revolutionary Guards, some of them benefited from the sanctions in two ways. First of all, it's always good for the hardliners to have tension with the rest of the world. Because as a hardliner, what you want to do is to go to people and say, you're in danger. People are trying to kill you, and you need somebody to protect you from them. And guess what? I'm really good at that. I think American politics is not so different. So the Revolutionary Guards benefit if the world is against Iran, it's putting sanctions on it, the Americans are denouncing it, and so forth. And going to a situation of peace with the world, that's new territory. You know, do you really need Revolutionary Guards? Why not just have a regular army under those conditions? So I think that's one. And then, as we said, they just have a lot of companies, and we don't even know all of the companies, which ones they own, and so forth. But we do know, you know, a lot of sanction busting has gone on through Dubai. So I think things are being imported third hand from Dubai. And then, as I said, if you can import them, you can mark them up for the country, and there's no competition because of the sanctions, so you make extra money. So all kinds of commodities are probably being sold by the Revolutionary Guards in this way at a premium. So those people, basically smugglers, right, are benefiting from the sanctions. But then there are other, you know, there are lots of companies, and some of them are, you know, petrochemical companies. And if Total and Shell get back in the game, the French and the Dutch were in Iran, and then they left because of severe American threats. I mean, they basically told Shell, if you ever want to have another gas station in the United States, you had better stay out of Iran. So, you know, the United States is a $17 trillion a year economy. You really, as a multinational, wouldn't want to be excluded from it. So that worked. But now, there are two kinds of sanctions, right? There's American sanctions and there's United Nations-backed sanctions. The United Nations-backed sanctions, which are also part of the EU, sanctions are going away. In 6 months, if the Iranians do what they're instructed to do, in 6 months, this is worth billions and billions. There are French CEOs of refrigerator manufacturers who are in Tehran right now saying, you know, you guys, your food's going bad. You need a French refrigerator like yesterday. And so BMW is there, and I can't tell you this. Apparently, you can't get a room in Tehran right now in a nice hotel. And the shark skin suits and the alligator shoes and all those are on full display. So, so those UN sanctions are going away in 6 months. The American sanctions could last longer and maybe a lot longer. They're in control of our Congress, so you know, good luck. I think there will be pressure on our Congress from American companies who are getting left behind because you know there's a bonanza out here. If that Pars South Pars gas field is developed, that's the biggest known gas reserve in the world. Do you know how many? I mean, you're really talking about trillions of dollars over time. So there are. I can guarantee you that ExxonMobil would like to be there with Shell and Total, but they're not going to be allowed to by Congress. So I think the international sanctions will go away pretty quickly. In which case, those like petrochemical companies that the Revolutionary Guards own are going to be working with European firms, and they're going to get rich. Everybody's going to get rich. This, you know.
Professor Cole, first of all, I'd like to express my huge admiration for your work and your advocacy of truth. For those of us who have been working on behalf of the deal, politically and otherwise, you are an invaluable resource. My question is on a sort of backstory level, or a more sophisticated level. One of the arguments against the deal has been, sure, we know this nuclear stuff is largely a pretext. But if the deal goes through, Iran will be a more powerful country, and we all know it's a bad actor in Syria, and it's a serious enemy of Israel. So I welcome your comments on both of those points. Number one, how do you see the Iranian role in Syria? Is it a negative factor or on the contrary? And secondly, how do you interpret the rather morbid fear of Prime Minister Netanyahu of Iran? Is that rational or irrational?
Okay. So with regard to Iran's extracurricular activities in the region, yeah, obviously I think it's playing an unfortunate role in Syria in propping up a regime that's brutal and has become mass murderers. And I think there are a lot of Iranians who are ashamed of this as well. And President Rouhani was asked yesterday, you know, how can you support a regime that's killed tens of thousands of its civilians, not just rebels. It drops bombs on kindergartens, and these bombs are not guided, so they just drop them on cities they kill indiscriminately. And Rouhani said, well, what proof do you have of that? So he didn't say, yes, we're supporting this regime and we're proud of it. He had to deny reality in order to go forward with this policy. And then he said, well, you know, we're not committed to a person. So it may be that even the Iranians are starting to back off of Bashar al-Assad. In any case, yeah, it's very unfortunate. But I would just point out that from 2012 to 2015, Iran was under the most severe economic sanctions from the international community that has ever been known by any country. They were even worse than the Iraq sanctions of the 90s. And yet, they're in Syria. And you couldn't put on more severe sanctions than that. It's just not possible to convince the world to do that. And even these sanctions probably couldn't be kept on forever because, you know, India was suffering from these sanctions itself. It needed Iranian oil. It needed to be able to pay for it. So, why would you think that Iran wouldn't be able to do this anyway? Say that the nuclear deal and the sanctions are probably irrelevant. And Iran has a lot of soft power in the region. It's got allies among the Lebanese Shiites. Lebanese Shiites are not, on the whole, religious people. They did a poll of people who voted for Hezbollah in Lebanon, and 50% of them said in this poll that they're not religious. So they're not, Lebanese Shiites are not supporting Hezbollah because they believe in Ayatollahs. They're supporting it because they think it protects them. But those are friendly towards Iran, the Lebanese Shiites. They see it as an ally. And the Alawites in Syria, a lot of the Christians in Syria, the Shiites in Iraq, the Shiites in Eastern Arabia and Saudi Arabia, the Zaydis in Yemen. You can't take away those soft power influences of Iran, even if sometimes they're exaggerated, because I don't think Iran has much purchase in Yemen. But you can't take that away by sanctions. So if it's being said Iran ought not to be allowed to play any role in the Middle East, and then I would just ask, well, how would you stop it? How? And anyway, that's not related to the nuclear issue. I think in fairness, I'm not going to go deeply into the Israel question because that's a whole different kettle of fish. We're going to stay on the nuclear issue. But there was another person who had a question back here, yeah.
You seem to hold a strong belief in terms of prosperity for Iran in the future. You think that that's probably the most probable scenario. I wonder if you could speculate on the most likely scenario in terms of the model that this is going to go. Is it going to be the Chinese model, South Korean, Malaysia, whatnot? If you don't mind.
The Saudi model.
Saudi model.
The state owns the oil. The oil is going to be 70% of the GDP. It's not now, but it will be. And if they get the gas, maybe it'll be 90%. The fossil fuels will be 90% of the GDP. So the state's going to be very powerful, and the state is going to give out goodies to the people. So it'll be very much like Saudi Arabia.
But don't you think that there's if you don't mind me asking, there's a huge difference in terms of socio-economic development between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and that's not very likely to happen?
You mean that the Iranians are more politically mobilized?
Not only that, but I mean social development. I mean in terms of education, technocrats you mentioned, infrastructure, so on and so forth.
Saudis of this generation are very highly educated, and they have wonderful infrastructure. And I don't know. When the youth revolutions hit the Arab world, these Gulf countries just gave their people money. They said, you can have a revolution, or you can have an extra $260 billion in welfare. People seem to have liked the second. So I mean, these things are unpredictable, but it seems to me that A, Iran is going to get rich. B, because the petrochemicals are owned by the state's going to get rich. The state will then be the vector through which this money is invested in the society, and that it will operate like the other oil states, with the exception that, as you say, Iran is much bigger population-wise, and that causes problems sometimes. The Shah never really solved this problem of how do you get the money into the hands of the people without causing a lot of inflation. How much absorptive capacity does the economy have, and so forth, which are not a big problem for Qatar, which mostly invests the oil money abroad. So there are bumps in the road, and regimes could make a mistake about this. But I think in the way that the system is operating, unless they privatize the oil companies, which I don't see them doing, it means the state's going to be running them, and it's going to get this income, and it's going to be investing it and using it. Yeah. Yes.
I'd also like to thank you for a really great talk. Two questions. The first is, how did you as a historian decide not to talk about Eisenhower's famous speech about atoms for peace and the provision of a reactor and highly enriched uranium to the newly re-enthroned Shah in the 1950s? Would that add something to the story to build that back in? And then second of all, is there sort of a quasi-religious principle in American politics that allows the American government to lie about things?
Well, we have a former diplomat amongst us, and so I'm loath to quote this proverb in his presence, but it has been said that the diplomat is a gentleman sent abroad to lie for his country.
Lie in foreign capital.
Yes, that's right. It's no personal impugning intended, but so yes, so governments lie. But I think with regard to the American Atoms for Peace program, back in the 50s, the nuclear corporations in the United States thought that the United States could make a lot of money by building plants abroad, providing this expertise, exporting fuel, and so forth. And so Eisenhower, as you say, was encouraging Iran to have nuclear reactors, and we gave the Iranians the medical reactor, which needs it's not high enriched uranium. It's only 19.75% that you need for the medical reactor, which is the borderline for high enriched. 20 and above is high enriched. So this is still considered LEU. It's still considered low enriched. But they have that reactor because the United States built it for them. And of course, the Shah was planning to have a lot of nuclear reactors back in the 70s, and there's, you can go back and see the advertisements in the New York Times for his plans, and nobody was concerned about that. He even at one point talked about developing nuclear weapons, and apparently he didn't even get a wrist slap. So it matters very much the posture of the country towards us, how we react. But I didn't include that piece of the puzzle only because it went into abeyance. And Khomeini closed all that stuff down. He called it the tool of the devil. And so it's really from 2000 that we have a new story starting. The nuclear, the isotope reactor for medical reactor is the only continuity element in it. Yes?
In what ways will the deal change the relationship between the U.S. and Iran? And what kind of benefits could the U.S. get from a better relationship with Iran?
Well, the deal itself doesn't change anything. All it means is that if the Iranians are inspected regularly and found not to be in violation of the rules of the terms of the deal, the U.S. might consider backing off some of these really severe sanctions. But at the moment, Iran is listed by the State Department as a state supporter of terrorism. Therefore, no American companies can get in there. So over time, if that estimation of Iran changes and the State Department delists it, and it becomes possible for American companies to invest there from the American side, then you also have the issue of there's no embassy. The Iranians still chant death to America in the street, and if you're a corporate CEO from America and you're in Tehran trying to make a deal and that's what you're hearing out the window, it could give you second thoughts. So I think, who knows, over 10 years maybe things could change, but you shouldn't expect a lot of change in the U.S.-Iranian relationships immediately. With regard to the French, Italian, and Korean and Japanese and so forth relationship, that's going to change really quick. And maybe they'll bring along some American partners at some point. There was one question from you.
One more question.
Okay.
Actually, I thought that the only solution to making connection between Iranian policy and religious Shia is Iranian constitutional law. So, like
Iranian what?
constitutional law,
Yes.
like the
Yes.
Article 71,
Yes.
that is speaking about the role of religion in Iran.
Yes.
But I think that you are just referred to this statement of Ayatollah Khamenei. Actually, I know that the role of leader in Iranian government is somewhat that can be through every decision from parliament or executive power. But actually, think about the Shia as a matter that just can change Iranian policy. We cannot refer to anything except Iranian constitutional law. As it says in, I don't know if I am clear or not, as it says in Article 110 that leader of Iran, Khamenei, can do everything that he wants. I mean that as a matter of, as you refer to, vilayat mutlaq. So I think as a matter of this juries, if we want to refer to Iranian policy as a matter of religion, it has somehow the problem that every Islamic matter has the problem of interpretation. As we go to some concepts like haq and hud, it means that we have some deadline and we have some just bottom line that cannot go over there. So I didn't get the actual point about the relationship between Shia and Iranian policy. So.
Yes, what I was saying is that Khamenei, as the Baliye Faqih, or the guardian jurisprudent, has the authority to decide whether Iran will have nuclear weapons or not.
Actually, we can.
He can't.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he has decided that they can't.
But he has decided that he can't, but it is not something fixed in Islam. It is something that can be interpreted as vice versa. As we have something like, I know you know some Persian, so I know Persian too.
Well,
but
the legal reasoning in Shiite law is never fixed because it's the reasoning of the jurisprudent. It's a jurisprudence law. It's not a codified law. And so, if you're saying that Khamenei could have a successor who interpreted the law differently so as to allow for nuclear weapons, theoretically this is correct. However, one of the principles of the Shiite tradition of law that we're talking about is ijma, is consensus. And Khamenei and Khomeini both have given the same fatwa about nuclear weapons being sinful. So I think there's a building consensus on this issue that succeeding jurists will be bound by. The other thing is that there's a dispute within Iran over whether some of Khomeini's pronouncements, whether they have the added status beyond just a fatwa or legal ruling of being hukm, of being a governmental rule. And I think something of this importance might well be a hukam. And so I actually personally think that it's very difficult for succeeding jurists to challenge this budding consensus. But if they did, then the international community can react to that in any case.
actually, yeah.
Thank you. I think we really ought to cut it. Please join me again in thanking Professor Cook.
They're so hard.